They didn't come to Earth as gods. They came as survivors of something they couldn't defeat. The Sumerian tablets don't describe a glorious descent. They hint at collapse, exile, and a sudden flight from a force so overwhelming it shattered their world and drove them across the stars. The Sumerian texts reveal the Anunnaki were escaping something bigger, something powerful enough to hunt beings we once called divine. So if they were running, what was chasing them? And is it already closer than we think? And if you're settling in tonight, letting the day fade behind you, you've found the right place to examine what those limits actually were. In the British Museum's Mesopotamian collection, fragments of the Atrahasis epic sit behind climate-controlled glass. Catalogue numbers K3399 and K3454. Identify them as part of the Assyrian Royal Library excavated from Nineveh in the 1850s. The tablets themselves are unremarkable at first. Baked clay, covered in cuneiform wedge marks pressed into the surface 4,000 years ago. But these particular fragments preserve something unusual for ancient administrative literature. They record a divine council meeting, not metaphor, an actual assembly with agenda, debate, and recorded dissent. The language reads less like mythology and more like parliamentary minutes. The gods convene to address what the text calls noise. But the context makes clear this isn't literal sound. Population growth, resource strain, ecological pressure accumulating over generations. The scribe who copied this text was documenting governance under crisis. Enlil, the assembly's chief administrator, calls for drastic intervention. Plagues are authorized. Then, drought. These are sequential measures, not impulsive wrath. And when corrective actions fail to stabilize conditions, the discussion escalates. But here's what makes scholars pause. Enki, the god associated with subterranean waters and technical knowledge, objects. Not openly. He cannot directly defy council authority. Instead, he speaks to a wall, technically complying with divine law while ensuring a human named Atrahasis overhears the warning. Build a vessel, preserve life, survive what's coming. This is not mythic chaos. This is documented protocol circumvention by a member of the governing body who recognized the authorized solution would eliminate institutional continuity entirely. The Atrahasis epic is not alone. And across museum archives in Philadelphia, London, Berlin, and Baghdad, Sumerian administrative tablets from the late 4th and early 3rd millennium BC show a pattern. Temple inventories, recording ritual object transfers between precincts. City lament compositions describing gods performing formal departure ceremonies before abandoning their sanctuaries. Wisdom literature emphasizing survival, land management, and generational knowledge transmission. Examined individually, each text serves its genre. Taken together, they document something closer to systematic preparation for institutional collapse. Comment where you're listening from tonight, whether you're drifting towards sleep or just beginning your day, because this investigation requires witnesses. What the Sumerian texts actually preserve is not a story of divine beings who decided to punish humanity on impulse. It's documentation of powerful administrators confronting forces they could not control. Forces environmental, social, and possibly cosmic, significant enough that even the Anunnaki, according to the texts themselves, chose strategic adaptation over direct confrontation. The traditional narrative is familiar enough. Gods grew angry at human noise. They sent a flood. One family survived. Civilization rebooted. But that narrative requires ignoring considerable evidence suggesting a different sequence. The tablets describe God's departing cities before disasters struck. They preserve divine assembly debates where decisions were contested, not unanimous. They record instructions given by deities preparing humanity for absence rather than punishment. And most significantly, the tablets document departures, procedurally executed, carefully archived departures. But they never describe returns with the same precision. For a civilization that mapped celestial movements with astronomical accuracy, maintained genealogical records spanning dozens of generations, and tracked individual livestock in temple archives. This vagueness is conspicuous. It reads less like poetic mythology and more like information deliberately limited. What if the Sumerian scribes were doing exactly what administrative scribes always do, maintaining continuity of information for whoever came after? What if the reason the texts never specify where the Anunnaki withdrew to is not literary convention, but accurate documentation of uncertainty? They recorded departures because departures were observable. Destinations remained unclear because the administrators themselves were responding to conditions whose full scope exceeded their authority. This investigation will proceed methodically. We will examine excavation data from Eridu, where 19 temple construction layers show not gradual architectural evolution, but structural adaptation to environmental instability. We will analyze the Sumerian king list's antediluvian chronology, 8 kings reigning for a combined 241,200 years before the flood, not as primitive exaggeration, but as a timekeeping system documenting extended crisis governance. We will read the instructions of Shurupak, composed in the generations before remembered catastrophe, and ask what its specific survival council reveals about conditions the author anticipated. We will return to the Atrahasis epic's divine assembly debate and trace why Enki's circumvention carried such procedural risk. We will examine Sumerian city laments, ritual texts describing gods performing formal departure protocols before abandoning their urban sanctuaries, and confront why beings with cosmic authority would need departure ceremonies rather than simply preventing whatever threatened. We will trace how Mesopotamian theology evolves after the flood traditions. Gods who once dwelt physically in temple complexes become increasingly distant, transcendent, cosmically remote. Divine presence shifts from residential to symbolic. Intimacy fades into administrative distance. And we will sit with the uncomfortable implication preserved across these independent textual traditions, that the Anunnaki were powerful, but power operated within constraints. That authority had limits, that even divine administrators could face systemic pressures exceeding their capacity to control. The flood in this reading becomes secondary, not the cause, but the symptom, the breaking point of environmental and social stability that had been deteriorating throughout the extended reigns the king list documents. The Anunnaki did not cause the disaster. The evidence suggests they recognized what geological and social forces were converging, understood those forces exceeded their governance capacity, and made calculated decisions about what knowledge to preserve, who to warn, and how to ensure some form of institutional continuity survived the coming rupture. Some, like Enki, chose to leave warnings and technical instruction. Others withdrew to whatever cosmic distance the later theological tradition describes. The tablets record these decisions in fragments. No single text contains the complete administrative record, but the pattern across multiple independent archives points toward something consistent. Beings with extraordinary capabilities facing an extraordinary convergence of destabilizing forces, making procedural decisions about knowledge, preservation, and survival protocol before withdrawing from direct physical governance. This is not speculation about ancient astronauts. This is not theory about extraterrestrial colonization. This is, if we take the tablets seriously, as institutional documentation, a historical record from the Sumerian perspective of administrators who held power within certain environmental and social domains. Discovering those domains were not absolute. A record of beings learning they were not the highest authority in whatever cosmic or geological hierarchy actually governed reality, and a record of what they chose to preserve before conditions made their continued presence untenable. The oldest written documents in human history do not describe gods destroying the world in rage. They describe gods discovering they could not hold it together, and adapting accordingly. The archaeological evidence for this interpretation begins beneath the desert in southern Iraq, where the first excavations uncovered something older than kingship itself. In 1889, the University of Pennsylvania expedition to Nippur began systematic excavation of what Sumerian texts identified as the religious center of early Mesopotamia. Over 11 years, archaeologists recovered thousands of cuneiform tablets from temple archives buried under centuries of accumulated debris. Most documented predictable administrative business, grain distributions, labor assignments, ritual calendar maintenance. But a subset of tablets from the final decades before 2900 BC show something different. Tablet CBS 10,673, now housed in the Penn Museum's climate-controlled storage, measures roughly 3 inches across. Reddish-brown clay, standard cuneiform script. At first glance, entirely routine temple inventory documentation. On the scribe lists ritual implements being transferred from one precinct to another within Nippur's temple complex. Bronze vessels, specific textile types used in purification ceremonies, sealed containers whose contents the text identifies only as essential instruction. The language itself is administrative, precise quantities, designated recipients, authorization signatures pressed into the clay's lower edge. But the final lines employ a verb, one-de, meaning to depart or to be sent away. And critically, The scribe marks this verb with the divine determinative sign, the cuneiform symbol resembling a star that precedes names of gods. The inventory isn't documenting objects being moved, it's documenting objects accompanying a departure involving divine subjects. Temple archives from Uruk and Lagash contain similar inventories from the same approximate period. Cult statue components being transferred between cities. Sacred knowledge tablets, those specifically designated for preservation, relocated to facilities outside primary urban centers. Ritual objects moved from lowland temples to higher ground installations. Independently, each tablet serves its archival function. Cross-referenced chronologically, they map coordinated institutional preparation for something requiring dispersal of centralized religious infrastructure. Meanwhile, excavation data from Eridu, the site Sumerian tradition identifies as the first city where kingship descended from heaven, reveals 19 distinct temple construction phases beginning in the 6th millennium BC. The earliest shrine sits directly on virgin soil with no prior settlement beneath it. Temple construction preceded urban development, but the subsequent 18 layers don't show gradual architectural refinement. They show structural adaptation. The platform heights increase. Foundations are reinforced against water infiltration. Drainage systems are expanded and redesigned multiple times. By the early dynastic period, the temple complex has been rebuilt repeatedly, each iteration responding to environmental pressures the previous structure could not accommodate. The archaeological term for this pattern is crisis architecture. Buildings redesigned not for aesthetic evolution, but for survival against persistent destabilizing conditions. And during the same centuries, these structural adaptations intensify. The administrative tablets begin documenting systematic redistribution of sacred objects and institutional knowledge away from the primary temple complexes, where gods supposedly maintained physical residence. Sumerian theology claimed divine beings dwelt within temple sanctuaries. The temple was not a symbol of divine presence. It housed the deity. Elaborate daily rituals fed, clothed, and maintained the god's physical accommodation within the sacred precinct. Yet here, in the late 4th millennium BC, the administrative records describe those same deities' ritual infrastructure being dismantled, catalogued, and transferred, not destroyed, not abandoned, carelessly, systematically relocated with procedural documentation, ensuring continuity of knowledge and cult practice, but elsewhere. Why would beings who descended from heaven, according to the texts themselves, require emergency relocation protocols? Why would gods with cosmic authority over earth and water need their sacred knowledge dispersed across multiple installations, rather than centralized in the sanctuaries built specifically to house them? The tablets don't explain the necessity. They document the procedure. Scribes recording departures because administrative continuity required documentation, even when, perhaps especially when, the reasons exceeded their authority to question. If the gods were transferring sacred knowledge and ritual objects with procedural urgency across multiple temple complexes during the same period, archaeological evidence shows persistent environmental crisis. what convergence of forces made staying in their primary sanctuaries untenable? The answer appears in a text that was never meant to explain mythology. It was meant to document procedure. The Atrahasis epic, preserved in old Babylonian copies dating to 1700 BC, but referencing events centuries earlier, opens not with divine anger, but with divine exhaustion. The gods complain about labor burdens. A solution is implemented. Humans are created to perform agricultural and irrigation work the lesser deities had been forced to maintain. For 1200 years, the arrangement functions. Then the text describes what it calls rigmu, a word often translated as noise, but whose administrative context suggests something closer to disturbance or pressure. Human population expands, agricultural land intensifies, or resource demands accumulate. The text specifies this is not sudden. It builds over generations until the divine council convenes to address what has become a systemic governance problem. This is not mythic chaos. This is institutional response to compounding strain. The assembly authorizes corrective measures. First, plague. The text describes disease sent to reduce population density. It fails to stabilize conditions. Next, drought. Agricultural output is meant to decline, forcing population contraction through resource limitation. But the corrective measures don't resolve the underlying pressure. They intensify social crisis without eliminating the fundamental imbalance between human expansion and environmental carrying capacity. And here the text does something remarkable. It records dissent. Enlil, the council's chief administrative authority, calls for comprehensive elimination. The language is procedural. He's not described as enraged, but as proposing a permanent solution to a problem sequential interventions have failed to address. He proposes flood, total reset, institutional discontinuity accepted as preferable to uncontrolled systemic collapse. The council debates. This is explicit in the text, not unanimous decree, but contested decision-making among beings whose authority apparently required collective authorization rather than individual fiat. Enki objects. But here's what scholars often miss. He cannot openly defy the council's decision once it's authorized. The text specifies he is bound by oath. Divine governance operates under procedural constraint. Even beings with cosmic authority are subject to institutional structure that limits individual action once collective decisions are formalized. So, Enki circumvents the restriction through technicality. He does not speak directly to the human Atrahasis. He speaks to the wall of the reed house where Atrahasis sleeps, describing aloud what someone would need to survive the coming disaster. Dimensions for a vessel, materials required, instructions for preserving seed stock and breeding pairs. Technically, he has not violated the oath. He has not directly warned a human. He has simply spoken within range of human hearing. This reveals something unsettling about the text's cosmology. The gods are powerful, but they are not absolute. They function within legal and procedural frameworks that constrain their actions, even during existential crisis. Authority requires authorization. Intervention requires justification. And when justification is collectively determined, individual dissent must operate through structural loopholes. Meanwhile, the disasters escalate exactly as institutional failure would predict, not as impulsive wrath, but as sequential interventions that worsen conditions without addressing root instability, leading to final authorization of comprehensive rather than corrective action. The flood becomes the last resort after graduated measures fail. Its crisis management escalation documented in administrative language by scribes recording governance under pressure. But the text never explains what made the underlying instability unresolvable through normal governance. It documents decisions and procedures, authorization, debate, circumvention, execution, but not the deeper forces that made human population expansion unsustainable within whatever ecological or cosmic parameters the divine council was attempting to maintain. The assembly could authorize plague. They could authorize drought. They could authorize flood. But nowhere does the text suggest they could authorize prevention of the conditions requiring those interventions. They respond to pressure. They don't eliminate its source, which raises the question the Atrahasis epic carefully avoids answering. If the divine council with authority over earth, water, and cosmic order could only manage symptoms rather than causes, and what fundamental instability were they themselves operating within? If the flood was escalation rather than punishment, the final stage of graduated crisis response after corrective measures failed, what long-term environmental, social, or cosmic imbalance forced even the Anunnaki into damage control rather than resolution? The Sumerians kept records of something they called the time before. The Sumerian king list, compiled around 2000 BC, but drawing from older sources, divides history into two fundamentally distinct periods separated by a single catastrophic event. The text is explicit about this rupture. It lists 8 kings who ruled before the flood, figures with names like Alulim, Alaljar, and Enmenluana, and assigns them reigns totaling 241,200 years. Then the text states, "The flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, kingship descended from heaven." And the chronology changes. Post-flood kings reign for decades or centuries, still long by modern standards, but no longer measured in tens of thousands of years. The timekeeping system itself appears to reset. Scholars have long dismissed the antediluvian numbers as mythological exaggeration, primitive cultures inflating their past. But the Sumerians were not primitive in their mathematical capacity. They developed the sexagesimal counting system, base 60, which we still use for measuring time and angles. Their astronomical records tracked celestial movements with precision. Their administrative archives counted individual livestock and grain, measures across decades. These were not people careless with numbers. One interpretation suggests the antediluvian figures represent something other than individual human lifespans, perhaps dynastic cycles, perhaps extended periods of crisis governance, where normal succession patterns collapsed and emergency administration continued across what would have been multiple generations under stable conditions. The numbers in this reading document duration of instability rather than biological age. But the king list does something more significant than preserve unusual chronology. It encodes historical memory of rupture, a before and after so fundamental that whoever compiled this document felt compelled to mark it with explicit language. The flood didn't simply happen within history. It divided history into incompatible eras requiring different timekeeping frameworks. And then archaeology discovered something unsettling. At Shuruppak, the city associated with the flood hero Ziusudra in Sumerian tradition, excavations in the 1920s revealed a distinct flood deposit layer dating to approximately 2900 BC. The stratum contains water-laid sediment interrupting normal occupation debris. Below the flood layer, one settlement pattern. Above it, disruption, then gradual reoccupation with different material culture. At Kish, excavators found similar evidence. A flood deposit approximately 11 feet thick, dated to the early dynastic I period, separating earlier occupation from later rebuilding phases. These are not global flood evidence. The deposits are geographically limited to southern Mesopotamia, but they are real. Of physical disruption in the archaeological record occurring at the approximate period, Sumerian textual tradition identifies as the moment kingship descended from heaven a second time. Textual rupture aligns with material disruption. The king list's chronological break corresponds to actual settlement discontinuity in multiple urban centers. Whatever the 241,200 years represent symbolically, they terminate at a moment when physical evidence shows genuine crisis, water damage, occupation interruption, institutional reorganization. The flood traditions are not fabricated mythology. They are cultural memory of real environmental catastrophe, significant enough to require complete restructuring of governance, settlement patterns, and apparently even timekeeping systems. Of course, but flood deposits explain the crisis's culmination. They don't explain its duration. If the antediluvian period documents extended instability, crisis governance measured in symbolic time because normal succession became impossible, then the flood represents not the problem's beginning, but its breaking point. The moment accumulated pressures exceeded every containment measure and forced total systemic reset. The king list preserves memory that something was wrong for a very long time before the final collapse. That kingship functioned under emergency conditions for periods so extended they required different chronological frameworks to document. That the flood was not sudden divine decision, but the terminal phase of destabilization building across what the text's compilers could only describe as ages beyond normal historical reckoning. If the flood marks a structural reset, the point where accumulated instability finally exceeded all governance capacity and forced complete discontinuity, what was happening environmentally, socially, and cosmically during those extended antediluvian periods that made normal kingship impossible and crisis administration the only sustainable model? Southern Mesopotamia was not supposed to sustain civilization. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates receives less than 6 inches of rainfall annually, too arid for agriculture without irrigation. No stone for building, no timber for construction, no metal deposits. Everything required for urban life had to be imported or engineered from mud and reeds. Yet here, in one of the most resource-poor environments in the ancient world, the first cities emerged. The civilization functioned entirely through water control. Canal systems diverted river flow into agricultural fields. Drainage networks prevented waterlogging. Levees contained seasonal flooding. The entire social structure, temple administration, labor organization, food distribution, existed to maintain hydraulic infrastructure that made survival possible. But the rivers were unstable. The Tigris and Euphrates flow through alluvial plains with minimal gradient. Their courses shift naturally over centuries as sediment accumulates, channels clog, and water finds new paths of least resistance. Archaeological surveys show former riverbeds miles from current channels. Cities that once sat beside major waterways found themselves cut off as rivers migrated. Of forcing complete settlement relocation or elaborate canal construction to maintain access. Meanwhile, irrigation itself created compounding problems. In arid climates, agricultural watering brings dissolved salts to the surface. Without adequate drainage, salts accumulate in topsoil. Over generations, productive farmland becomes sterile white crust. Cuneiform records from the 3rd millennium BC document declining barley yields and agricultural collapse in regions where salinization reached critical levels. And beneath this fragile system, groundwater was rising. The Persian Gulf coastline during the 4th millennium BC sat considerably north of its modern position. As sea levels rose gradually through the Holocene period, saltwater intrusion crept inland through subsurface aquifers. Freshwater tables rose, or bringing salinity closer to root zones. Marshlands expanded. Cities built on previously stable ground found foundations undermined by changing hydrology. Eridu's 19 temple construction phases show direct architectural response to this instability. Early structures sit at ground level. Later phases build on raised platforms, first modest elevation, then increasingly substantial artificial mounds designed to keep sacred precincts above rising water and seasonal flooding. Drainage systems are expanded, redesigned, rebuilt. The temple complex adapts continuously to environmental pressures that never stabilize, and Eridu was dedicated to Enki, the god of the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean Sumerian cosmology placed beneath the Earth's surface. And Enki's domain was precisely the hydrological system causing civilization's greatest vulnerability. He governed the waters that sustained life and the waters that threatened to overwhelm it. In the Atrahasis epic, Enki is the god who circumvents the council's flood authorization to warn humanity. In the Eridu Genesis, another flood tradition, he again intervenes to preserve the flood hero Ziusudra. The god associated with subterranean waters repeatedly acts to ensure human survival of water-based catastrophe. This is not poetic irony. It suggests Enki's mythological role encoded practical knowledge about hydrology, survival protocol during flooding, and perhaps recognition that water systems were reaching critical instability. The environmental evidence shows southern Mesopotamia operating at the edge of sustainability throughout the late 4th and early 3rd millennium BC. River courses migrating, soil salinizing, groundwater rising, marshes expanding, agricultural productivity declining in critical regions despite intensified labor. The crisis the Divine Council debates in the Atrahasis epic, population pressure exceeding environmental capacity, was not abstract theology. It was documented reality in a civilization whose survival depended entirely on maintaining precise balance between water control and water destruction. And that balance was failing, not suddenly, but across generations. Irrigation systems requiring constant maintenance and expansion just to maintain previous productivity. Cities adapting architecture to rising water. Agricultural lands abandoned to salt. Settlement patterns disrupted by river migration. The flood traditions preserve memory of the system's breaking point. The moment when accumulated environmental instability exceeded all adaptive capacity and forced total discontinuity. But if ecological destabilization was real, building across centuries toward inevitable collapse, how did the Sumerians encode preparation for that collapse? What knowledge did they preserve? What warnings did they embed in texts for whoever survived to rebuild? Someone in ancient Mesopotamia wrote a survival manual and then made certain it would be copied for thousands of years. The instructions of Shurupak exists in multiple tablet versions spanning over a millennium. Copies from the 3rd millennium BC through the Old Babylonian period. This is significant. Mesopotamian scribes didn't preserve texts arbitrarily. Transmission across generations indicated institutional priority. Something about this particular composition warranted continuous replication. The text presents itself as advice from Shurupak, a king of the antediluvian city of the same name, to his son Ziusudra. Its tone is not mythological. It's pragmatic, almost bureaucratic in its directness. Do not buy a donkey that brays. It will split your midriff. Do not locate a field on a road. Do not plough a field at a path. These are not cosmic pronouncements. They're survival counsel about resource management, social positioning, and avoiding unnecessary exposure to loss. The text addresses land carefully. Multiple sections emphasize prudent agriculture, knowing when to plant, when to harvest, how to preserve seed stock. It warns against overextension, against acquiring property that draws excessive attention, against entanglement in disputes over boundaries or irrigation rights that could destabilize household continuity. There are warnings about speech. A loving heart maintains a family. A hateful heart destroys a family. Let your speech be excellent. The instructions emphasize restraint, careful social navigation, preservation of lineage through wisdom rather than confrontation. It reads less like philosophical reflection and more like preparation literature, counsel designed to ensure a family unit could survive periods of instability through cautious resource management and social insulation. But here's what makes this text remarkable. The author is Shurupak. The recipient is Ziusudra. In the Eridu Genesis, another Sumerian flood tradition, Ziusudra is the flood hero, the figure warned by Enki to build a vessel and preserve life. He is the Sumerian equivalent of the Akkadian Atrahasis and the later biblical Noah. The instructions of Shurupak, then, are not generic wisdom literature. They are specifically framed as knowledge transmitted from father to son across the generation that experiences the flood. The text positions itself chronologically and genealogically at the exact moment of remembered catastrophe, and the advice it contains focuses obsessively on continuity, preserving family line, managing resources through crisis, avoiding social entanglements that might prevent adaptation when conditions shift, maintaining knowledge transmission across generational rupture. This is not coincidence. This is encoded preparation. The pattern across flood traditions becomes clearer when examined together. In the Atrahasis epic, Enki warns a specific individual, not humanity collectively, but one person selected for knowledge transmission and survival protocol. In the Eridu Genesis, Enki again warns Ziusudra specifically, providing technical instruction for vessel construction and species preservation. The instructions of Shurupak frame this as normal intergenerational wisdom transfer, but the content emphasizes exactly the skills required to maintain lineage and knowledge through systemic collapse. And the text's continuous replication across centuries suggests later scribes recognized it as something more significant than routine paternal advice. Preparation precedes catastrophe, not panic, but deliberate knowledge preservation. Selection of specific lineages for warning, technical instruction embedded in wisdom literature, resource management council that doubles as survival protocol. The gods in these narratives don't simply authorize destruction, they ensure continuity. They select individuals. They provide specific, actionable instruction. They create conditions for institutional knowledge to survive the rupture they cannot prevent, which reframes the flood traditions entirely. If divine intervention focuses not on executing catastrophe, but on preserving selected knowledge and lineages through catastrophe, then the god's primary concern is continuity after inevitable collapse, not punishment requiring elimination. The instructions of Shurupak, preserved across 1,000 years of copying, transmitted exactly the knowledge required for family units to survive extended crisis and maintain cultural memory through environmental breakdown. Someone, whether divine administrator or wise king, understood what was coming, and rather than preventing it, prepared for it. Encoded survival protocol, selected recipients, ensured knowledge transmission would continue after the system collapsed. If humanity was warned, not collectively, but through specific lineages given specific instruction, were the gods preparing for their own departure rather than humanity's destruction? Were they ensuring civilization could rebuild without divine administration, because divine administration would no longer be physically present to maintain it? The Sumerians had a genre of literature dedicated entirely to recording abandonment. On the city laments, compositions like the lament for Ur and the lament for Sumer and Ur describe urban collapse in ritual language. These are not historical chronicles in the conventional sense. They're structured liturgical texts performed during ceremonies meant to acknowledge and process civic catastrophe. But their content is striking. The laments don't describe gods destroying cities in anger. They describe gods leaving cities before destruction arrives. In the lament for Ur, the goddess Ningal pleads before the divine assembly to spare her city. Her petition is denied. The text then describes her performing formal departure, abandoning her temple, leaving Ur to whatever fate the council has authorized. The city's fall follows her withdrawal, not her wrath. The language is procedural. She has abandoned her cowpen. He has abandoned her sheepfold. The mistress of the city, like a bird, took wing from her city, like a bird, took wing from her land. This is not metaphor for destruction. This is documentation of departure ritual. The deity physically withdraws from the sanctuary before catastrophe strikes. Divine absence precedes civic collapse. The lament for Sumer and Ur extends this pattern across multiple cities. Each urban center has its patron deity. Each deity is described performing similar withdrawal, formal abandonment of temple residents before disaster. The text preserves a sequence: divine departure, then environmental or military catastrophe, then human suffering in the absence of divine protection. Scholars typically read these laments as poetic personification, gods representing cities, divine abandonment symbolizing civic defeat. But Mesopotamian theology didn't treat divine residence symbolically. Temple complexes housed gods physically. Daily rituals fed, clothed, and maintained divine presence as literal, institutional fact. The temple was not a symbol of the god. It contained the god, which makes the departure language in these laments more significant. If gods physically dwelt in temples, then departure rituals describe actual relocation of divine presence, not poetic metaphor, but administrative reality. And there's historical precedent for exactly this practice. During military conflicts throughout Mesopotamian history, cult statues were removed from temples and relocated to secure locations before enemy armies arrived. This wasn't sacrilege, it was standard protective protocol. The statue physically embodied divine presence. Preserving the statue preserved the god's connection to the city, even during occupation or destruction of the physical temple structure. Later kings documented these relocations in royal inscriptions. Statues of Marduk removed from Babylon during Persian conquest. Statues returned ceremonially after conflict resolution. The practice was institutional procedure, not mythological allegory. The city laments describe the same pattern, but framed as divine decision rather than human preservation effort. The gods themselves choose departure. They abandon sanctuaries before catastrophe rather than remaining to prevent it. And critically, the texts document this as procedural withdrawal, not impulsive flight. Ningal argues before the assembly. Her petition fails. She then performs formal departure according to protocol. As this suggests, even in crisis, divine actions follow institutional structure. Departure requires authorization, just as the Atrahasis epic showed intervention required assembly consensus. But here's the unsettling implication. Divine absence precedes civic collapse consistently across multiple independent city lament traditions. The pattern is not isolated to one text or one city. It's a repeated sequence preserved in ritual literature across southern Mesopotamia. Gods depart, cities fall. If divine presence prevented catastrophe, withdrawal would make sense only if the gods recognized they could no longer maintain stability. If their authority prevented environmental or social collapse, departure would be unnecessary unless their authority itself had become insufficient to counter whatever forces were destabilizing the region. All the laments preserve memory of gods choosing strategic retreat over ineffective resistance. They document formal abandonment procedures, suggesting even existential crisis required procedural compliance. And they frame departure as decision preceding disaster, not consequence, but precondition. Why would deities with cosmic authority over earth, water, and social order need to withdraw from their urban sanctuaries, instead of simply preventing the disasters that followed their departure? What conditions could make divine administration untenable? What forces could render even God's continued presence irrelevant or impossible in the cities built specifically to house them? The Divine Council's final decision was not unanimous, and that detail changes everything. The Atrahasis epic preserves the assembly debate with unusual specificity. And after plague and drought fail to stabilize conditions, Enlil presents his proposal: comprehensive elimination through flood. His reasoning is administrative, not emotional. Sequential corrective measures have failed. The underlying imbalance persists. Partial intervention only prolongs instability. Therefore, authorize total reset. The text describes this as formal proposal requiring council authorization. Enlil cannot simply execute the decision unilaterally. Even as chief administrator, his authority requires collective consent from the assembly of gods. This is institutional governance, not absolute monarchy. The council authorizes the flood, but Enki dissents. And here's where the text becomes remarkable. Enki is bound by the council's decision once it's formalized. And he cannot directly violate assembly authorization without breaking divine law, oath structures that apparently constrain even gods. The text is explicit about this. He is bound, so he circumvents through technicality. He does not speak to Atrahasis. He speaks to the reed wall of Atrahasis's dwelling, describing aloud what would be necessary to survive: vessel dimensions, construction materials, instructions for preserving breeding pairs, and seed stocks. Technically, no direct warning to a human. Technically, no violation of oath. But functionally, complete subversion of the council's intent. This reveals something profound about Mesopotamian divine cosmology. The gods possess extraordinary power, but that power operates within legal frameworks that limit individual action. Authority is distributed. Decisions require authorization. Even during existential crisis, procedural structure constrains what gods can do unilaterally. They are not omnipotent beings exercising arbitrary will. They are powerful administrators operating within institutional hierarchy that survives even catastrophic decision-making. But Enki's defiance suggests something else: recognition that the authorized solution is inadequate. The flood will eliminate the immediate problem, but it will also eliminate institutional continuity. Knowledge will be lost. Social structure will collapse completely. Civilization will have to rebuild from zero. Unless someone survives with enough knowledge and resources to restart. The compromise that emerges is striking. The council's decision stands. The flood proceeds. But Enki ensures selective survival and preserving enough human capacity to maintain continuity across the rupture. The gods get their reset. Humanity gets survival. Knowledge transmission continues. The flood becomes containment rather than solution. It doesn't resolve the underlying instability. It imposes discontinuity when management becomes impossible. And then the later versions add something even more significant. In the epic of Gilgamesh's flood account, the survivor Utnapishtim, the Akkadian equivalent of Atrahasis and Ziusudra, is granted immortality after the waters recede. Enlil, seeing that someone survived, initially rages at Enki's circumvention, but then he boards the vessel, touches Utnapishtim and his wife, and grants them eternal life. Immortality is not reward, it's functional preservation. Whilst the flood hero becomes living archive, someone who witnessed the before, survived the rupture, and can transmit knowledge of what happened across indefinite time. Human memory degrades across generations. Immortal memory doesn't. Utnapishtim lives at the mouth of the rivers, far from human civilization. When Gilgamesh seeks him out centuries later, seeking immortality himself, Utnapishtim recounts the flood, preserving the memory for another generation. The gods don't grant immortality as blessing. They grant it as archival necessity. Someone needs to remember what happened and why, even after all witnesses die. Someone needs to maintain knowledge of the crisis that forced divine withdrawal. The flood is not triumph. It's acknowledged failure of governance. While the divine council authorizes discontinuity because they cannot stabilize continuity. Enki circumvents to preserve minimum viable institutional memory. The survivor is made immortal to serve as permanent record of what occurred when even God's authority proved insufficient. This is crisis management documentation preserved in mythological language. The Atrahasis epic records beings with cosmic power recognizing their power has limits. Records assembly debate, acknowledging corrective measures failed. Records compromise, ensuring some knowledge survives total systemic collapse. The gods survive the flood, but their relationship to humanity changes fundamentally afterward. They remain, but differently, more distant, less directly involved in daily governance. and operating through different mechanisms than the intimate temple resident system that existed before. If the gods survived the crisis, but their governance model required complete restructuring, what did post-flood religion actually look like? How did divine administration function after the rupture, when even the gods themselves had demonstrated they could not maintain stability within the previous system? After the flood traditions, something fundamental changed in how Mesopotamians talked about their gods. Early dynastic temple theology, 3rd millennium BC, describes gods as physically resident. Temple complexes are divine households. Daily rituals feed the deity. Priests maintain the god's wardrobe. The sanctuary contains the god's actual presence, not symbolic representation. All hymns address deities as dwelling within specific cities, occupying specific temple rooms. The language is intimate, domestic. The gods live among humans in architecturally defined spaces. By the Old Babylonian period, early 2nd millennium BC, this language shifts. Temples become monumental but less residentially specific. Gods are described as cosmic authorities dwelling in distant heavens. Divine presence in temples becomes mediated through cult statues rather than direct habitation. The relationship grows more abstract, more hierarchical, less physically immediate. This is not gradual theological evolution. It's a documented shift in how divine presence is conceptualized and described across Mesopotamian religious texts. Temple architecture reflects this change. Early structures are modest sanctuaries, rooms for the god, administrative spaces for priests, storage for offerings. Later temples become massive staged platforms, ziggurats rising in multiple tiers toward the sky. Monumental scale increases. But the language describing gods dwelling in these structures becomes more ambiguous. The Epic of Gilgamesh preserves this transition in narrative form. When Gilgamesh seeks immortality, he travels to find Utnapishtim, the flood survivor granted eternal life. The text describes Utnapishtim living at the mouth of the rivers in a remote location far from human cities. He has not returned to civilization. The gods did not bring him back. He remains isolated, preserved, but separate. When Gilgamesh finally reaches him, Utnapishtim recounts the flood. He describes the god's terror during the catastrophe, cowering like dogs, climbing to the highest heaven. And after the waters recede, they descend to accept offerings. But their relationship to earth has changed. They no longer dwell intimately among humans. They remain overhead, distant, involved through ritual rather than residence. The epic frames this distance as permanent consequence of the flood. The gods survived. Humanity survived. But proximity did not resume. Meanwhile, royal inscriptions from post-flood dynasties change how kings describe their relationship to divine authority. Early kings claim divine parentage, literal descent from gods. Later kings claim divine favor, divine selection, divine blessing, but not divine cohabitation or family lineage. The language becomes political rather than familial. Gods grant kingship from heaven. They authorize rulers. They ensure victory. But they do not walk in palace gardens or sit in throne rooms. They remain cosmically remote, intervening through oracle, omen, and ritual confirmation, not physical presence. This theological shift directly follows the chronological period Sumerian tradition identifies as the flood rupture. Before the remembered catastrophe, gods dwell physically in cities. After the catastrophe, gods authorize from heaven but maintain cosmic distance. Cultural memory preserves not just that the flood happened, but that divine-human relationship fundamentally restructured afterward. The gods did not disappear. They did not abandon humanity entirely. But the intimacy ended. Direct physical governance gave way to remote cosmic authority mediated through ritual and institutional hierarchy. And the texts never explicitly state why this distance became necessary. They document that it occurred, preserve that it followed catastrophe, and encode it in both theological language and architectural evolution. Temple height increases as divine proximity decreases, as if physical elevation compensates for cosmic remoteness. But the pattern suggests something uncomfortable. If gods with authority over earth, water, and cosmic order became distant rather than more present after the crisis, it implies their withdrawal was not punishment, but necessity. Something about the post-flood world made continued intimate governance impossible or untenable. The flood did not destroy the gods, but it altered their capacity or willingness to maintain direct physical administration. They survived by accepting distance. They preserved authority by restructuring how that authority operated, from resident administrators to remote cosmic overseers, which raises the question the texts carefully avoid answering directly. If the gods became distant rather than destroyed, if they chose cosmic remoteness over continued urban residence, what does that imply about the forces they faced? What conditions would make physical withdrawal preferable to continued presence for beings described as having created and governed civilization? What were they unable to control that made staying impossible? Even after the flood reset the system, they could not stabilize. The Sumerian texts never describe the Anunnaki winning. Across thousands of cuneiform tablets, administrative records, royal inscriptions, hymns, laments, wisdom literature, or cosmological texts, there is no account of divine beings conquering whatever forces destabilize their world. There are records of management, documentation of debate, protocols for departure, instructions for survival. But nowhere do the texts preserve memory of the gods restoring the stability that existed before the crisis. They document adaptation, not triumph. Consider what the evidence actually shows when examined together, rather than in isolated disciplinary categories. Administrative tablets from Nippur, Ur, Uruk, and Lagash record systematic transfer of ritual objects and sacred knowledge between temple complexes during the late 4th millennium BC. These are not routine inventories. They document emergency redistribution, cult implements, instructional tablets, and items marked with divine determinatives being relocated with procedural urgency. The language is bureaucratic, but the pattern is unmistakable. Institutional preparation for discontinuity. Archaeological data from Eridu shows 19 temple construction phases, each redesigned to address hydrological instability the previous structure could not accommodate. Platforms raised, drainage expanded, foundations reinforced against rising water. This is crisis architecture. Buildings adapted continuously to environmental pressures that never stabilize. The site sacred to Enki, god of subterranean waters, shows persistent struggle against the very element he supposedly governed. The Atrahasis epic preserves divine council debate during compounding crisis. Population growth, resource strain. Sequential corrective measures, plague, a drought that fail to restore balance. Enlil proposes comprehensive reset through flood. Enki dissents, but remains bound by assembly authorization, circumventing through technicality to ensure survival of knowledge and lineage. This is not mythology. This is documented institutional decision-making under conditions exceeding governance capacity. The Sumerian king list divides history at the flood. Antediluvian kings reigning for 241,200 years. Post-flood kings reigning for comprehensible durations. The chronology itself encodes rupture. Whether the antediluvian figures represent symbolic time or crisis cycle documentation, the text explicitly marks the flood as structural break, requiring different timekeeping frameworks. And archaeological flood deposits at Shuruppak and Kish confirm material disruption at the chronological period tradition identifies as this rupture. Environmental evidence shows southern Mesopotamia operating at the edge of sustainability throughout this period. Tigris and Euphrates migration forcing settlement relocation. Soil salinization destroying agricultural productivity. Rising groundwater undermining urban foundations. Marsh expansion consuming previously stable land. The civilization functioned entirely through irrigation infrastructure, maintaining precarious balance between water control and water destruction. That balance was failing across generations, not suddenly, but through accumulated deterioration no amount of adaptation could reverse. The instructions of Shuruppak preserve survival literature framed as wisdom from the generation experiencing the flood to the generation that must rebuild. Pragmatic counsel about resource management, social restraint, lineage preservation. The text positions itself chronologically and genealogically at the exact moment of catastrophe, emphasizing knowledge transmission across discontinuity. This is preparation documentation, someone encoding what would be necessary to maintain continuity after systemic collapse. City laments describe gods performing formal departure rituals before urban catastrophes, not destruction in anger, withdrawal following procedural protocol. Ningal abandons Ur. Multiple deities leave their urban sanctuaries across the lament for Sumer and Ur. Divine absence precedes civic collapse consistently. Thus, these are not poetic metaphors, but documented liturgical remembrance of gods choosing strategic retreat when their continued presence could not prevent disaster. The Atrahasis epic's climax shows Enki circumventing council authorization to warn Atrahasis, who survives to preserve knowledge. Later versions grant the flood hero immortality, not as reward, but as archival necessity. Someone must remember what happened and transmit that memory beyond normal human lifespan. The gods create living documentation of the crisis that force their governance restructuring. And after the flood traditions, theological language shifts fundamentally. Gods who previously dwelt physically in urban temples become cosmically remote. Divine residence becomes divine oversight. Intimacy becomes hierarchical distance. Temple architecture grows monumental as divine proximity decreases. Kings claim divine favor rather than divine cohabitation. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes gods cowering during the flood, ascending to highest heaven, descending afterward, but maintaining that distance permanently. Every thread, archaeological, textual, environmental, theological, points toward the same pattern. Powerful beings confronting forces exceeding their governance capacity. Making institutional decisions about knowledge, preservation, and survival protocol. Documenting their own limitations through administrative language that later generations would read as mythology. The texts never claim the gods prevented the crisis. They document how the gods managed it, prepared for it, ensured something would survive it. But they do not describe conquest of whatever forces, ecological, hydrological, possibly cosmological, made the existing system unsustainable. Here is what the Sumerian records actually preserve. Beings with extraordinary authority over specific domains. Discovering those domains were not absolute. Administrative power sufficient for stable conditions proving inadequate during compounding instability. Council debates where even collective divine authority could only authorize damage control rather than prevention. Protocols for departure when continued presence became untenable. Instructions ensuring human civilization could rebuild without requiring direct divine governance. The flood was not divine punishment. It was acknowledged failure of management, the point where accumulated environmental and social pressures exceeded all adaptive capacity and forced authorization of total discontinuity because partial interventions had failed repeatedly. The gods did not cause the flood as punishment for human misbehavior. The evidence suggests they authorized it as terminal crisis response, when every other measure had proven insufficient to stabilize conditions they could not ultimately control. And critically, the texts preserve that even this authorization required compromise. Enki's circumvention ensuring survival. Immortality granted to preserve institutional memory, departure rituals performed before withdrawal, knowledge encoded in wisdom literature, sacred objects redistributed to multiple locations. And all of this documents preparation for continued absence, gods ensuring civilization could function after they were no longer physically present to administer it. The theological shift from intimate residence to cosmic distance reflects this restructuring. The gods survived. Their authority survived. But their governance model required fundamental change. They could no longer maintain direct physical administration in urban temples. Whether due to environmental conditions, hydrological instability, or forces the texts cannot or will not specify, continued intimate presence became impossible. So they withdrew. Not fled, withdrew according to protocol documented in administrative and liturgical texts. They restructured authority from residential governance to remote cosmic oversight. They ensured knowledge transmission through selected human lineages. They granted immortality to living archives who could preserve memory of what happened. They created conditions for civilization to rebuild and continue without requiring their daily presence. This is what the oldest written records in human history actually document. Not gods destroying the world in rage, not omnipotent beings executing arbitrary punishment, but powerful administrators discovering the limits of their power. Beings with authority over earth and water confronting forces, geological, hydrological, environmental, possibly cosmological, that exceeded their capacity to control. The Sumerian texts preserve memory of gods who could not hold the system together, who debated their options, who made calculated decisions about what to preserve and who to warn, but who authorized discontinuity when continuity became unsustainable, who withdrew from intimate governance when intimate governance no longer functioned, and who never returned. The tablets record departures. They document the procedural steps taken before withdrawal. They preserve the knowledge deemed essential for human survival without divine administration. But they never describe the gods coming back. They never document restoration of the intimate residential theology that existed before the flood traditions. The distance became permanent. The cosmic remoteness replaced urban presence. Divine authority continued. But from somewhere else, operating through different mechanisms, maintaining different relationship to humanity than had existed during the antediluvian period, the king list measures in symbolic time. The Anunnaki were not escaping in the sense of panicked flight. They were adapting to conditions they could not prevent, restructuring their governance when the previous structure became untenable, making institutional decisions, ensuring continuity after rupture they recognized as inevitable. But they were escaping something. The texts make that clear through pattern, if not explicit statement. Forces they could manage, but not control. Instability they could document, but not eliminate. Environmental conditions they could adapt architecture to address, but not reverse. Social pressures they could attempt to correct, but not resolve. Something larger than their authority, something persistent enough to require emergency protocols, departure rituals, knowledge preservation, and fundamental restructuring of how divine administration functioned. The texts don't specify what that larger force was. They document its effects: environmental crisis, social instability, compounding pressure requiring increasingly drastic interventions. They preserve memory that even divine council authority proved insufficient, that beings powerful enough to create humans for labor, authorize plagues and droughts, and ultimately flood. The world still could not stabilize the underlying conditions making those interventions necessary. They could only survive those conditions by accepting limits, by restructuring, by withdrawing direct presence, by ensuring human civilization could continue in their administrative absence. The oldest written records in human history preserve a memory not of gods destroying the world, but of gods discovering they could not hold it together, of powerful beings confronting the boundaries of their power, of administrators whose authority, however extraordinary, operated within constraints they could not overcome. And when those constraints made continued intimate governance impossible, they adapted, they documented, they prepared humanity for their departure, and they left, not to nowhere. The texts describe ascension, withdrawal to distant cosmic dwellings, continued authority from remote heavens. But physically, residentially, intimately, they left the urban temples built to house them. They abandoned the direct administration model that had structured early Mesopotamian civilization. The ziggurat platforms rising towards sky in later periods are not just architecture. They are monuments to distance, physical structures reaching toward gods who no longer descend. Ritual spaces designed for worship of beings who remain overhead rather than dwelling within. And if you've stayed with this investigation all the way through, you now know something that changes how the oldest human writings must be read. The Sumerian texts are not primitive mythology requiring metaphorical interpretation. They are institutional documentation of crisis governance by beings whose power had limits. The Anunnaki were escaping something bigger than themselves. The texts never claim they conquered it, only that they survived it by adapting, restructuring, and ultimately accepting that some forces exceed even divine authority to control. That's what the tablets actually say. If you take them at their word, if you read administrative language as administration, liturgical protocol as protocol, wisdom literature as survival documentation, and flood traditions as cultural memory of real rupture, the gods left. The records remain. And the question they preserve is not about punishment or divine anger, but about what kind of forces could make even gods choose strategic retreat over continued presence. What were they unable to hold together? The texts document everything except that answer.